Hi.
I know I'm wearing a different shirt than I'm about to in a minute, but let's talk about Slaughterhouse 5 and the role fiction plays in history. First, I want to talk about why. We're going to talk about Slaughterhouse 5, which is a work of fiction, a novel, when this is primarily a history channel, or going to be a history channel. Still working out them kinks. The reason is because literature, novels, they have a lot to say regarding what people are thinking, what people are going through, and how things last with them over time. In fact, I had a professor in college who knew I was a history student, minoring in English, and kept trying to convince me to join the English department program by arguing, and I quote here, "English is more history than history is." And while I vehemently disagreed with him then, and I still do today, it makes an interesting point. People, when they live through things, it affects them. History tells us a lot about maybe those firsthand experiences. It tells us a lot about what they actually went through, the events that happened, the context, but it doesn't and really can't delve into the psyche. It can't delve into the actual people's minds nearly as much. We can do interviews with people, we can do some oral history projects, and that's really it, and that can tell us a lot. And how people remember things in oral histories tells us a lot about what they choose to remember, choose to forget, can tell us a lot about trauma, joy, everything in between, and so much more. That's a topic for another time. But novels, literature, things voluntarily written to not be factual all the time, to be something that is out there, something that is unrelated to the exact events that happen, or at least not trying to be an exact representation of real events, can also tell us quite a bit about what people perceived of that, what the people who went through it had to endure long term, not just in those experiences, not just in those events at the time, but also throughout the rest of their lives. And there are a lot of really good examples of fiction that tell us more about history than maybe actual history does. And I'm going to talk about two of those today. The first one is Slaughterhouse 5, as I already mentioned. The second one is Beowulf, and I want to talk about that one maybe towards the end. So if you're looking for Beowulf kind of stuff, just go ahead and skip. So Slaughterhouse 5 is a book, if you haven't read it, by Kurt Vonnegut. He's a World War II veteran. He's written many books, all of them darkly hilarious and very intriguing. Slaughterhouse 5 is possibly, if not probably, his most famous work. The name comes from the fact that when he was a prisoner of war in Dresden, they weren't kept in prison cells, they weren't kept in all of these different areas, they were partially at least kept in old slaughterhouses. And the one that he, or at least the character in his book, Billy Pilgrim, stays in is called Slaughterhouse 5, and that's where the title of the book comes from. So the book, right here, follows a character named Billy Pilgrim who survives the firebombing of Dresden and becomes, as they put it in the book, unstuck in time. Now what that means in Vonnegut's narrative is that the character will fall down, and when he hits his head, he's back in the Dresden, concentration camps. Or he'll walk through the door in his honeymoon suite and walk out on a vacation some other time in his life. He'll sit down in his favorite chair, and then as his, butt hits the chair, he's on the airplane, the crash of which he's about to survive. So he's seeing and experiencing essentially as close to all moments of his entire life at once as he can get, but still have this human concept of linear time. So he's jumping up and down among his entire timeline, but because he's been in all of these places before, he is aware of what's about to happen, what's already happened, and he just kind of faces everything, even the horrible things, with a sort of calm cynicism. Basically what that means is he doesn't freak out when the plane's about to crash. He doesn't look at people and say, "Oh, don't worry, you're going to be fine," right? He just takes it for what it is. And that kind of leads us to the refrain of the book, the most common phrase that Vonnegut uses over and over and over, which is, "So it goes." The reason this book is important to study as a historian is because it's pretty much a glimpse into the brain of someone who survived one of the most horrifying experiences of the war. The firebombing of Dresden is one of the times when the United States and Britain unknowingly bombed prisoner of war camps that contained their own men. And it was horrifying. I mean, imagine being a civilian, let alone a prisoner of war, let alone a soldier. You're living in Dresden, just going about your daily life. You're not necessarily someone who is helping or hindering the war effort, and yet the city erupts into fire around you overnight. And that's just to put it lightly. You really should read the book and see the exact details that he puts in. So what you're getting is literally a first-hand account, an insight into what Kurt Vonnegut went through as he survived this account. But you don't see it from Vonnegut's point of view, you see it from Billy Pilgrim's point of view. So he's narrating, for a small part of the book at least, his own experiences in the third person. And you get this view from someone who is fairly cynical, this Billy Pilgrim character who has already been through the firebombing of Dresden multiple times because he is unstuck in time. And you get this idea that maybe his whole life is flashing before his eyes, that he's not only getting a glimpse of the past but also of the future. Or perhaps he's on his deathbed and he's experiencing everything in between. Or perhaps the trauma has driven him crazy. We don't know. We don't get an answer to how he becomes unstuck in time. We don't have an answer as to whether or not he really is abducted by the aliens from Tralfamador like he claims to be and put on display in a zoo like he claims to be. We don't know how much of it is real, how much of it is just his trauma speaking out. But the fact that all of this is something that sticks out in Billy Pilgrim's life tells us more about the experience of veterans of World War II who experienced some of the worst crap that we can ever possibly imagine. It tells us more about what people survived and how they survived. This is a time when we really didn't know or understand what post-traumatic stress disorder was. We still called it shell shock. And so you have these people who are going through their lives untreated, having to just tough it out and stick it through because that was the societal norm. If you had mental health issues, you were weak. They just had that stiff upper lip and they pushed on. And all of that is perspective you cannot get from a regular history book. All of that is perspective you cannot get from some sort of academic's point of view analyzing the events and the oral histories of the firebombing of Dresden. You can still get extremely powerful points of view. You can still get extremely powerful history, but you're not going to get it organized and put so poetically as you will in that novel at a point where everybody can understand it, everybody can read it, anybody can pick up Slaughterhouse 5. Anybody can look at it and understand what Vonnegut went through because he lays his brain out for you clearly, concisely, and attractively. Now, the next book I wanted to talk to you about is actually Beowulf. It's not really a book so much as it is an epic poem, but still, work of fiction, vitally important. Now, some background on Beowulf. We don't actually know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. We have a general idea of the timeline. We know it's Norse-ish, but aside from that, we got no idea. Now, I actually had to help teach this specific book while I was a graduate student working at the University of Alabama. I worked with a professor who taught the History 101 course, which is the world history from pretty much man as we know it begins, all the way to, for that class, I believe it was the 100 Years' War. This book was so vitally important because we don't have a lot of sources that tell us about Old Norse values, what Old European values there were, pre-Christian religion, pre-Christian morals, beliefs, how they taught these morals and beliefs. We don't know. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is because the Catholic Church came in and destroyed it all or Christianized it all and took a lot of their stories and turned them into Christian-friendly stories, getting rid of this pagan view and bringing in these Christian views. However, they found that they still had essentially the same values, and so they don't have to compromise their morals, they don't have to change their values, they do have to change the source of those values. Now, while you're thinking about it, yes, this is why we have holidays like Christmas, which used to be Saturnalia, Halloween, right, which is, still celebrated very much in a fairly pagan way. This is why we have Valentine's Day, why we have Easter, right? All of these kind of solstice holidays, all of these holidays that are adopted and used now worldwide is because we took the pagan traditions away from them and Christianized them. Now, as far as Beowulf goes, what this book can offer us is way more than just your typical epic poem adventure kind of thing. In this book, we get to learn a lot about gender roles. We get to learn about manliness, honor, and how they viewed war and how they viewed fighting monsters. Fighting monsters is not something that ever really happened, but saving people from a monster to help other people who can't help themselves was extremely important to them. And that's something that Beowulf does over and over and over again in this book. He puts himself on the line and saves people. Granted, he often does it for money, but still, he's got this ability, he's going to use it. He is this strong man who provides for people. Now, whether or not we still agree with or abide by those gender norms, those gender roles, this is a window into their world. It tells us what they saw. Men were the providers, the protectors. Women were the home defenders, the homemakers. And these are all perspectives we would not have as historians if we did not have access to Beowulf. It's a literature work. It's a novel. It's a poem. It's fiction. There's no monster. There's no big epic battle that needs to happen. Beowulf doesn't actually have to save people from some thing that's coming to destroy them, but that is what they value. And that book tells us so much about their idealism of heroes and honor-bound service. I could keep going on and on and on about this, but I'm gonna have to stop there. There's so much more, and I know I kind of only touch on the tip of the iceberg. I'm still pretty vague on the topic in this video. Maybe I can get more specific in the future. At least hopefully now, as you study history, you won't just look at the boring academic books, because trust me, I've read a lot of them. I don't like a lot of them, and I love history. Academics have made history way too difficult to understand for the regular person. They expect it to kind of trickle down from their dense academic view into this sort of textbook, slightly easier to digest version, into the here's what we can teach the masses. And I think we can just cut out the middleman. And fiction, novels, teaching people through mediums they already want to read is one way we can make history more accessible to the masses and more entertaining. So pick up a novel. Ask yourself, what does it tell you about people? What does it tell you about the world you currently live in? I don't care if it's some fiction fantasy novel like Game of Thrones or The Inheritance Cycle or Harry freaking Potter. Every novel has something to say about the time it was written in.